Hey friends, welcome to Story Time. Carla here in the Souk Child, Youth and Family Building. Thinking a lot about difference lately and what it means to be different. And sometimes people want to fit in, right? They want to belong. And so sometimes difference can be erased or minimized. Sometimes people are afraid of being different or of people who are different from themselves. And so today's story is about celebrating difference. And it's about recognizing that our world is wonderful because of difference. And the things that make us different are the things that make us interesting and unique. But the most important part to remember is that one person's difference is not better or worse than anyone else's, and all people deserve to be safe and never suffer violence or discrimination because of their difference. And I know that's like a really heavy thing for people to hear, but it's also a key to hope, right? Because if we make the world safe for difference, the more variety, the more beauty we all get to enjoy. So with that, today I'm going to read a story, and it's called To Mrs. Gibsons. You see that? And it's a story by Toyomi Igus, and the pictures are by Daryl Wells. To Mrs. Gibsons. I once knew two Mrs. Gibsons. See, there they are. So the person that is speaking, these are the two Mrs. Gibsons. See, they look very different, but they have the same name. Interesting. And they're playing with a ball. Do you ever play with ball? Play pass? On sunny days? This Mrs. Gibson was tall. Her skin was the color of chocolate. She was born in America in a place called Tennessee. You see her? They're all cuddled up reading a story just like we're reading right now. This Mrs. Gibson was small. Her skin was the color of vanilla. She was born in Japan in a place called Gifu. Do you see? They're looking at the globe. There's so many wonderful places in the world. So these two Mrs. Gibsons come from two very different places. This Mrs. Gibson gave hugs that were like being wrapped up in a great big fat bearskin rug. Come here and give me some sugar, she would say. This Mrs. Gibson gave hugs that were like being wrapped up in a light, down-filled comforter. At bedtime, she'd stroke my hair and hum Sakura until I fell asleep. Wow. Different hugs, but hugs are good. Whether they're big, fat, squishy hugs or gentle, soft hugs, hugs are nice. This Mrs. Gibson was loud. She had a big laugh, a big voice, which would get louder when she was angry or when she was singing, and she seemed to be singing all the time. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. Do you know that song? This Mrs. Gibson was quiet. She would cover her mouth when she laughed so you could never see her teeth, and when she was angry, she got even quieter. Different ways of showing feelings. This Mrs. Gibson had small hands that could make the littlest, prettiest strokes of a pen when she would write our names in Japanese. Do you see them? Kumiki, Akimi, Toyomi, Yoshiteru. They're sitting at the table, practicing their calligraphy. This Mrs. Gibson had big hands. They looked like they covered all the keys on the piano when she played her favorite spirituals. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine, let it shine, let it shine, let it shine. Look at them raising their voices and singing. Sometimes this Mrs. Gibson would look kind of sad, and then she would let me dress up in one of the kimonos she had packed away in an old trunk. These are very special, she would say as she tied the obi around my waist. Don't get dirty. The other Mrs. Gibson's clothes were much too big for me to dress up in, but I liked to wear her fancy hats. This is my Sunday go-to-meeting hat, she would say as she'd take the long pointy hat pin out of my hands. Don't get it dirty. Different, but very special. And similar instructions. In either case, don't get these special clothes dirty. In the evening in the garden, this Mrs. Gibson would help me make magical lamps by catching fireflies and putting them in a jelly jar. They would glow, and then we'd let them go. Later at dinner time, this Mrs. Gibson would make more magic. Her hands would turn little bits of napkins into a whole flock of long-necked cranes. We would throw them into the air where they would fly high and then flutter down to the ground. Happy birds, she would always say. That's called origami. That's Japanese paper folding, where you take these beautiful pieces of paper, or sometimes napkins, and fold them in really interesting ways, and you can make all sorts of animals and flowers. It's very impressive. That might be an idea for craft time. This Mrs. Gibson always had a pot of rice cooking. We would eat it with bits of meat and vegetables on it with plenty of shoyu. Shoyu is soy sauce. Anytime we were hungry, she could take her long chopsticks and stir up dinner in the blink of an eye. See? This Mrs. Gibson always had a pot of greens cooking. Turnip greens, dandelion greens, mustard greens from the garden. Everything she cooked seemed to take a long, long time. They both sound delicious to me. I love lots of different kinds of food. This Mrs. Gibson had short curly hair that she would oil and braid up every night while she listened to the radio. She liked to braid my hair too, but she would always give me one big fat braid that would hang down over my forehead. See that? Different ways of doing hair. I didn't like that braid, so I would go to the other Mrs. Gibson and she'd take it out. This Mrs. Gibson used to have long, stick-straight hair, but she cut it short and tried to make it curly. She said she wanted to be more American. Well, that's interesting. That's kind of like what we were talking about at the start, where sometimes we try to fit in, right? But maybe she just has beautiful hair just the way it is. She doesn't have to be more American because she's just right just the way she is. But I think each of us at some point or another in our lives want to fit in and feel more the same. And so maybe we can encourage each other to be who we are, because who we are is what is beautiful. This Mrs. Gibson's other name was Kazumi. Everyone called her Kaz or Connie because they couldn't pronounce Kazumi. Sounds like they weren't trying very hard. It's not that hard to say. This Mrs. Gibson's other name was Viola. Everyone called her Vi or Reverend Gibson because she was a church minister. I called her Nanny because she was my grandmother. And I called her Mommy because she was my mother. Look at that. That's why they are both Mrs. Gibson. I once knew two Mrs. Gibsons. They were very different, but they had a lot in common. They both loved my daddy, and they both loved me. So a family with so much difference and so much similarity and so much love. And that is my hope for all families. I hope you enjoyed today's story, and I hope that you can look about the world and see how you are different and how you are the same, and feel proud of who you are and make the world safe for the people around you. All right, see you next time.